So then we just check yours, and I'll have mine upstairs. Just make sure everyone's good with that. They are on. Yeah. Yeah. But I think everyone's struggling, like nobody's doing stuff or going places. So. Maybe we need to be more trying to figure out more aggressive ways.
All right, I think we're ready to get started. And so welcome to the Corner Society, the longest running society in the history of medicine in the United States. It's been around since 1934. Thank you all for coming up. I'm in Calraz. I coordinated together with Rob Riley in the back, who does all of the work to make this happen. So thank you again. And thank you to the Rochester Academy of Medicine for hosting us. And special thanks to the Hospital of Medicine who helped co-sponsor this event. And it's really exciting for me to welcome Dr. Robert Aronowitz, who was also a special mentor to me, but who is a really distinguished scholar. And I'll just say a little bit about his background. Dr. Aronowitz, MD, he holds the Walter Leonore Annenberg Professor in the Social Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was also founding director of the Health and Societies program and had been chair for almost a decade of the renowned Department of History and Sociology of Science. He received his MD from Yale University. He did his residency at Pennsylvania Hospital, and was a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholar. He was in practice first and then went into academia and has played a leadership role at Penn and was also a co-director of the well-known Health and Societies program, the Robert Wood Johnson program at Penn. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and received numerous fellowships, including the Guggenheim, RWJ funding, the Russell Sage Foundation, and I just can't list all of them. He is the author of multiple books that are quite influential. Some of them I teach regularly, and I assume some of you do as well. He's the author of Making Sense of Illness, Science, Society, and Disease, Unnatural History, Breast Cancer and American Society, Risky Medicine, Our Quest to Cure Fear and Uncertainty, and recently a co-editor of a book on prevention and the HPV vaccine. He's also incredibly well published, not just in terms of academic books, but also a sought after commentator in New York Times, in different policy journals, including the Millback Quarterly, as well as many public health and policy journals. And Dr. Aronowitz will be here today discussing his newest work, which is kind of this big picture, thinking about all the themes that he's worked on and all the books he have just listed kind of come together for this newest project that I'm delighted that he's going to be sharing with us today. So thank you for making the drive and thank you for coming out to speak to us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk, Entangled Bodies. Joining me in welcoming Dr. Robbie Aronowitz.
thanks, Michal, and thanks people showing up in the rainy night. And those of you on Zoom. This project's been gestating for a really long time. You know, Michal said it's a summation. I don't know if it's a summation or a reiteration of obsessions that I've had. And like most things I've ever done, it emerged from things that bug me or, you know, or perplexed me in the clinical care or, you know, that I've experienced myself or friends and family members. And just to give you one example from the social world, for any of you who are doing clinical medicine, it's a very familiar story. About 15 years ago, at age 66, a good friend of mine was diagnosed with prostate cancer after getting a high value on a screening PSA blood test. And my friend was an academic, not in medicine, and he reviewed, you know, the current medical literature as an amateur. And but he was very, he quickly got, you know, got to the point where he knew there was only one clinical trial that actually compared surgery to no surgery among men who had the same early stage of cancer that he had. And over time, you know, in this study, there was a clear survival advantage to the men who had surgery. So he chose surgery. But he was surprised and regretful when a few years later, 2 newer clinical trials were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, both begun in the PSA era, the era when these screening blood tests were done. And they showed, one study showed no benefit to surgery, and the other showed some minor benefit in some subsets. It was a multi-country study, and this benefit was at the expense of many, many men getting impotent and incontinent. So when my friend first came to me, I had voiced some skepticism about the relevance of the evidence he had reviewed, because as I tried to explain to him unsuccessfully, cancer detected in the pre-PSA era, when people had some kind of sign or symptom that got them to a doctor, the prognosis of those cancers is likely to be much worse than the cancers detected by screening. Epidemiologists have a name for this, they call it length time bias. But I came to believe that my friend's regret didn't only result from a kind of, you know, little epidemiological error or bias, but from more general assumptions about disease, assuming a cancer is a cancer, a disease, somewhat or completely independently from the way we find it, name it, and classify it, which is an old obsession, of course. And his situation, from my perspective, is one of the many where evidence needs to be interpreted in light of how our bodies and knowledge of them are being transformed by the intensity of medical interventions, diagnostic and therapeutic. And so I've been trying to define this general problem and make sense of it, which is what this kind of book project's about. And apologies in advance. There's some historical case studies in the book and in my talk in a way, but there's largely a screed here, you know, cri de coeur coming out of me that I'm going to try to present. And the overall argument, make sure it's not advancing. There it goes. Oh, you know, my eyes are not that great. The overall argument is that powerful medical interventions are rapidly and widely diffused. Can you see that? No. There they are. There it goes. Okay. Maybe I'll just look at the screen there. Bodies and diseases are transformed. This leads to challenges for translating aggregate knowledge to the care of individuals, and other challenges, such as distinguishing the effects of disease from intervention, greater dependence on medicine, and resulting vulnerability, and increased demand for more interventions. Let me add, you know, just in the beginning, some clarifications and caveats. By translation, I'm focusing on the last step in a long bench to bedside chain of events, how clinicians and patients and consumers apply knowledge from clinical experiments excuse me, to individual diagnostic and therapeutic decisions. My focus is really on advanced Western societies and chronic medical conditions, and their often complicated medical management. The project does have implications for the lack of investment in the health infrastructure necessary to use interventions effectively and safely in poor regions, but I'm going to say little about them in the talk tonight. Lastly, I don't want to be understood, which you're probably thinking already, that I'm somehow anti-medical intervention, especially while we're still in the midst of a deadly global pandemic, where politically manipulated skepticism of vaccination and other effective and necessary public health measures remains a terrible problem. But I'll get to the nuance of my argument a little later, but it's not nihilistic or Luddite. But let me give you a little preview of the talk first. Okay, I'm going to situate the project within some existing approaches, give you a snapshot of what I mean by the highly intervened in body. I'm going to focus on translation challenges tonight, though. That's one part of, one of 5 challenges, kind of challenge that I deal with in this book draft. And I'll hint at some of these other consequences beside translation, but give them much less shrift. And then a little bit implications for policy, training, etc. The so what part of the book, of the talk. Okay. My project's in conversation with some well-developed critiques of Western biomedicine, such as, the harm caused by medical interventions, iatrogenesis. And most people think of Ivan Illich's book, from the 70s. Whose name I'm blocking on right now. The problematic expansion of medicine, often understood as medicalization. Movements within medicine today, reformist movements, which I'm sympathetic to slow down medicine, too much medicine, especially preventing overdiagnosis, and the Choose Wisely campaign of the American Board of Internal Medicine, and the impact of coexisting medical problems, something we refer to as comorbidity. Now, none of these approaches really focus on complexity as the endpoint. It's about harm, waste, distraction, and specifically the complexity that emerges by the wide and rapid diffusion of powerful medical interventions as they affect decisions, managing illness, and navigating healthcare. So I want to focus on complexity, which is not a simple thing to do, because I think some of this complexity is contingent. It's in our hands. It's under our control. It's worth reducing and factoring into the regulation of new interventions and research, and for what kind of future we can expect and plan for. Okay, and that's the overall. So what do we mean by the highly intervened in body? And I have a lot of statistics and research by others that I use in the book, but just to most of us I think intuitively get this. The average American has 3 visits to a physician a year. About half the American population visits an emergency room in a year. The average American gets 12 new prescriptions for medications, including 1 antibiotic prescription, 9 lifetime surgeries. You can go on and on about this. The highly intervened in body begins in some sense before life begins, with surveillance and prenatal care, and intensifies throughout the life course. Others estimate that, this is some data from the IMS, from Medicare. Others estimate that the number of prescribed medications in the US doubles every 20 years. There's other ways to illustrate the massive amounts of current interventions. For example, focusing on over-the-counter medications not included in this slide. Some estimate that over 25 billion doses of acetaminophen, that's Tylenol, are consumed yearly in the US. And about 28% of Americans have used an acetaminophen-containing product in the previous week. I'm not going to belabor this, but I just wanted to make clear that the material aspects of what I was talking about. I should say, when I've given this talk once before, and I was telling Michal, my daughter's a philosopher, and she gives every talk she gives is full of conceptual diagrams in a way. And under her influence, I decided to experiment with this for the first time. Anyway, I want to talk about how all that intervention, what I showed in the last slide, leads to challenges for knowing what's effective and safe for individuals living with many interventions. Now, rather than enumerate all the drivers, I'll focus on a few pathways that might be interrupted or modified. This slide focuses, like in the the left-hand column, on the ways. In the left column, we do research on the safety and efficacy of new interventions, and regulate them and their impact on clinical practices in the middle column. And the resulting challenge is translation. Lots of factors in the world outside of medicine are left out here. I'm not explaining the role of capitalism or political influences or underlying values. There we go. Let me begin with the role played by two prominent features of the modern biomedical research and regulation. The global trials with quote unquote naive bodies and surrogate markers that are often of short duration. And let me explain this in another slide. The gap between research, the subjects where we get the knowledge from and the actual bodies in which the interventions end up. And essentially, more and more of our knowledge of new drugs and devices comes from clinical trials that are conducted by contract research organizations in poor and middle-income countries, where there might be what they call treatment-naive subjects who promise higher likelihoods of seeing benefit and fewer side effects, as well as lower cost, and an end run around some ethical challenges. Not a good end run, I should say. In order to efficiently conduct trials, proxy outcomes and short time horizons characterize a lot of these and other trials. And I don't know, you know, proxy outcomes means you're worried about somebody, you know, whether some drug will cure cancer, but what you're looking at is some marker of cancer activity. That's something that you can pick up in a short time period. And, you know, you might care about whether people are alive, you know, 5 years from now, but you're only studying things for 3 months. That's what short time horizons means. Approved drugs and devices and practices later on, however, meet people with many comorbidities, not treatment-naive bodies, and past and concurrent treatments, and whose bodies are, as a consequence, more idiosyncratic. You know, in some ways, bodies today are more different from each other than they've ever been, in a medically consequential way because of all the interventions. And this leads to a lot of translation challenges and other consequences I'm going to go into, including increasing adverse drug reactions. And of course, you know, this is somewhat overdetermined, but this is a slide from the CDC, and it shows this remarkable rapid increase over the course of just 7 years in the number of emergency room visits for adverse effects of medical treatment, something all like lumped together. And, you know, I'm not claiming that everything has to do with the amount of interventions and their interactions with complex bodies, but I think, you know, I'd like to suggest that's one plausible explanation. Okay, so in addition to the way knowledge comes at us with global clinical trials and naive bodies, I want to turn now to a few. I'm very interested in, you know, in sort of some self-reinforcing cycles, some automatic feedback loops, some autocatalytic reactions, some reasons why rapid change is happening that drive the rapid introduction and diffusion of medical interventions. Cycles that, you know, I think are drivers of these translation challenges. So, you know, all of these things, one of these cycles is between the conditions prevailing in initial research and regulation and our increasing reliance on what's called phase 4 study to know what's safe and effective. For those of you who don't know, the typical way, especially the life cycle of a pharmaceutical as understood in research, is to understand it as 4 phases: testing on animals in the laboratory, then looking to see what safe and effective doses are, then an experimental clinical trial, and then phase 4, which you can think of as a post-marketing research, or you can think of it as the real world. And, you know, one of the chapters is titled in my book, Living in the Phase 4 World, because we're all data at the moment for so many things. And, okay, a little too many arrows, thanks to my daughter here. And I have to say, I call one of these cycles the buy now, pay later cycle of diffusion and regulation, in which, and I'll just read from the slide here, but if this isn't clear, tell me. There's a small group here and I can try to explain it. The drivers of fast approval lead to more reliance on the post-marketing period, phase 4, for evaluation and safety. The promise of phase 4 evaluation at the same time enables different elements of fast approval. This promise like casts its shadow back. Let's do the quick and dirty thing. We can always study it in the real world later. You know, a recent example, you know, it's not that recent at the moment, it's a year old, was the FDA, was all over the New York Times and places, had the controversial approval of Alzheimer's drug, Aduhelm. And in the end of the day, since the data wasn't great that this drug was safe and effective, like many of these controversial approvals, the drug manufacturer promises to do phase 4 surveillance, and the FDA promises to reconsider the drug after the real world data is back. And that's just an acute example. More systematically built into our system is the longstanding FDA policy of approving substantially equivalent medical devices without any clinical trials at all, as long as there is a promise to evaluate their safety in phase 4 study. That's the way typical stuff, medical devices are regulated. And don't ask me about surgical practices, as some, my students are always shocked when they ask me, and how do we know whether surgical practices work and what is approved? And I tell them we don't, and there is no approval process for them. Okay, so a third driver, in addition to this buy now, pay later idea, and the gap between research subjects and actual bodies, is the role of hastily introduced interventions that ultimately result in increased demand for intervention. That is, interventions that are just put out into the water without adequate testing. And I call this the fast pace. And there's a cycle here where the fast pace of introduction and diffusion changes the apparent epidemiology of the problem, makes people believe that stuff is safe and effective, and it encourages more use. And I'm going to illustrate this all with prostate cancer, which forms a chapter in the book as well. In fact, I started, I wrote a book about breast cancer. I thought maybe I would do something. I got kind of tired of writing a whole book on cancers, whatever, but it figures as a special case study. And I'm referring to this as a looping effect. Some of you may have heard this term. It usually is attributed to philosopher of science Ian Hacking, but there's many ideas that are very similar to this by economists, even sociologists like Robert Merton. And in the history of prostate cancer, we have a condition that went from a rare to a deadly diagnosis in the early 20th century, to a diagnosis affecting hundreds of thousands of American men yearly by the end of the century. And the looping effect kind of goes like this. This is data from the SEER, this NCI, National Cancer Institute has a kind of sample registry of different regions of the country where they follow everything about cancer, diagnosis, treatment, survival. And you see here this dramatic rise in prostate cancer incidence following the late 1980s diffusion of PSA screening, which was introduced roughly in the late 1980s, approved in the mid 80s. And the higher prostate cancer incidence that occurred then with constant mortality meant, by just mathematics, simple arithmetic alone, lower case fatality and better survival. And what I mean by that is, your survival rates and what we call case fatality are ratios in the number diagnosed to numbers who either survive or who die. And if you increase the number of people who are diagnosed, by definition, you will end up with better survival or lower case fatality. And because these are just kind of mathematical ratios. And, this remarkable, again, from SEER data, this remarkable change from mid-1970s to the turn of the century in the 5-year survival rates from different cancers. But you look at prostate cancer, it went from a 69% 5-year survival rate to a 99% survival rate. And, the null hypothesis, so to speak, here is that it has everything to do with this change in numerator and denominator, and not the effectiveness of, there weren't really new treatments. And as I started in the initial anecdote, the efficacy of just PSA screening itself is not big enough, even if you believe it's real, to account for this kind of change. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that you have, something introduced into the water without much evidence. It changes the apparent perception of efficacy of the underlying epidemiology of disease, and it makes people believe that that screening and radical treatment, the things that we do to prostate cancer, are actually working, and that drives more. This changes these changed attitudes, change more behavior, and it becomes kind of a self-reinforcing cycle, virtuous or vicious, depending on your perspective. Okay, here. Okay, the fourth driver of translation challenges I want to talk about is the role played by the fast pace of technological change and diffusion of interventions, the fast diffusion and change in undermining straightforward translation. And I'll illustrate what I'm talking about here with a quote from a 2015 consensus statement of an expert panel that had reviewed the evidence for the safety of screening mammography. And I'll just read this. This is a working group published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Said this working group recognized that the relevance of randomized controlled trials conducted more than 20 years ago should be questioned, given the large-scale improvements since then in both mammographic equipment and treatment for breast cancer. More recent, high-quality observational studies were considered to provide the most robust data with which to evaluate the effectiveness of mammographic screening. And what's going on here is that the expert group is trying to explain that they're discounting the older, however robust evidence and valuing more recent but less robust evidence because of widely diffused improvements in technopractice or perceived improvements in technopractice, more sensitive screening MRIs, better mammograms, equipment. And what I want to call attention to is the way the rapid and often evidence-free diffusion of these technopractices on the ground undermines the relevance of older evidence. It creates a kind of antegrade amnesia, an inability to form stable pictures of recent events, which is I have lots of examples of this, in the chapter that covers it, that all throughout medicine. Okay, the last driver I want to talk about of translation challenges, I'm going to get to some other challenges too in this talk, that I want to mention follows from the great amount of research done within practice. I was talking to Michal earlier about her kids being inside a clinical trial for vaccine. I hope I did just break confidence around it, and that's buzzing in my head right now. Anyway, there's like I said, we're all living in a phase 4 trial world in a way. We're all, in some sense, part of clinical trials, but also a lot of clinical research, explicit clinical research. Classic experiments is done all over medicine, especially advanced medical care, in oncology and other academic settings. And one prominent place of entangled research, improvisation, and care is the resuscitation of premature babies. In many ways, an entangled, historically new entangled body that just began existed since the 1930s. And it's been entirely dependent on technology such as the incubator, but also administrative changes like the presence of pediatricians in the delivery room and the widespread use of the APGAR score, a kind of rough and ready measure of how well a baby's doing in 1 minute and 5 minutes. And by way of background, the incubator itself was first displayed as a freak show attraction at the World's Fair in Coney Island. That's what's pictured, on your left here. And it was modified to the more familiar incubator on your left, a technology that's become central to the specialized neonatal intensive care units that have allowed the resuscitation and survival of premature infants and sick babies who would have otherwise died. Now, probably anybody here in medicine knows this story in broad outlines, and that soon after the incubator became introduced in the US especially, and certainly by the late 1940s, it was clear that something terrible was happening. It was an epidemic of bilateral blindness that ultimately affected over 10,000 infants in the US. It was first labeled retrolental fibroplasia, and it led to intensive research and near panic, I would say, in the emerging world of pediatrics and neonatal intensiveness. And an underlying question that has bedeviled this situation, but highly intervened bodies in general, was whether RLF, what it's now called retinopathy of prematurity, whether it was iatrogenic or this is from a newspaper magazine article, or whether it was, in some sense, the unavoidable price being paid for the improved salvage of the very premature infant. Now, by the 1950s, there was consensus that supplemental oxygen had a lot to do with this thing. And in some sense, these new incubators were so airtight. And people also believed that the clinical clues of hypoxia, too little oxygen in the kids, were not good enough. So, and there was nothing bad about oxygen. So why not use it liberally? And over the 75 years, like, since this ophthalmologist Theodore Terry described RLF, or retinopathy of prematurity, there's been intensive clinical experimentation within practice, the phenomenon I'm talking about right now, of different strategies for supplemental oxygen and other interventions. And we arguably still don't know, at least to the degree we'd like to know, the right strategy, how much oxygen to give, to newborn babies. As seen as these quotes, starting with Terry, who had the correct clinical intuition that something to do with premature birth and incubator life was at fault, though initially he thought it might be light in the ICU and in the incubator itself. And I guess I'll read these quotes. This wonderful pediatrician, William Silverman, has written, who was an actor in these controversies and wrote really trenchant analysis of what's going on. And my own chapter on premature babies is highly dependent on his work for giving me clues. And also I'm very sympathetic to his argument. When he wrote his book that he called, I think, A History of RLF, a Parable, he wrote to this in 1980, to this day, when oxygen is administered to premature infants, they're exposed to the intertwined risks of brain damage, death, and RLF, with nothing more than authoritative guesswork as protection. And Silverman hoped that clinical experimentation, if people just did more randomized trials, we'd get to the answer. And we'll see in a second that it hasn't panned out that way. And by the 2010s, people are saying things like, it's amazing that we've been doing neonatology for so long, and we still don't know what oxygen level should be. And another commentator, titrating a sweet spot that allows for maximum survival and minimal ROP based on age of the infant, gestational age at birth, and other factors still eludes physicians. So I really don't have time to unpack the history of why we don't know. That's a talk in itself. But I want to instead briefly mention two episodes that illustrate a different the translation problem associated with the entanglement of research and practice. One is from the kind of beginning of this story, and one is quite recent. One is the first randomized controlled trial ever done of oxygen strategies, led by an ophthalmologist named Kinsey in 1955. And then more recently, starting in the beginning of the 2000s, but lasting, final results were not available to the early 2012 or 13, were three acronymic studies. They stand for things, but they were three multi-center international trials that were done. And let me start with the Kinsey trial. And I'm subtitling this, The Perils of Adaptive Designs, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And the Kinsey trial had 18 different neonatal intensive care units, over 700 babies that weighed under 1,500 grams. And in order to adapt to the fact, and this is where the adaptation comes in, and I'm very interested in this concept and practice. In order to adapt to the fact that by 1955, almost all clinicians believed oxygen was a big culprit here, and oxygen use was being widely restricted in practice, Kinsey and colleagues used an adaptive design. In this case, they modified the traditional randomized controlled trial to adapt to the needs of the babies being resuscitated. So for the first 3 months to the end of the trial, they were going to randomize equally to each restrictive oxygen to a liberal oxygen for the first 3 months. And then they were going to unblind the results to a group of people and see if more babies who were getting oxygen restriction were dying, because they knew that this could be a problem. And if not, then everybody else in the study would go into oxygen restriction. And the statisticians assured them they could have a reasonably good result if they did it this way. Unfortunately, over the next few years, not from the results of the study, but from wide oxygen restriction became widespread everywhere. In fact, some ventilators were sometimes filled with, so you couldn't give more than 40% oxygen to babies. People were they had blood on their hands about this blindness and didn't want to repeat it. But it became clear to some people at the beginning, but certainly over a few years, that there was a much higher mortality, much higher lung disease, what we now think of as hyaline membrane disease or ARDS, and other serious complications in the kids who were being, just in general, all over the country, presumably due to this oxygen restriction and other practices. And by 1970, there was again this malaise and bad feeling among neonatologists, that somebody characterized as unrelieved gloom. We can claim the great decrease in the occurrence of retrolental fibroplasia, but the great increase in the death rate looms as large as a terrible cloud. And some people estimated that, like, for every baby saved from blindness, 10 kids were dying. The second episode, that I'm, but let me just tell you a little history here. For about after Kinsey, and after this realization that the randomized trial didn't solve the problem, in fact, it created a false impression of what the practice was. There was 50, and I think this caused an effect here. There was 50 years of what I characterize as tinkering, without any large-scale clinical experiments. There were small bedside incubator site experiments within practice, producing contradictory results and no consensus. It was very difficult to organize another large randomized trial of oxygen strategies because beliefs had been hardened and this bad odor of the misleading results of the Kinsey trial. However, by the 21st century, there was enough angst in the neonatology community, and also things had changed technically, especially the availability of easy oxygen saturation monitoring and other techno practices that could permit these coordinated studies. And I'll just read you a little bit about these studies. One of the most kind of controversial or interesting features of these studies is they knew that physicians, especially NICU nurses, would try to give more or less oxygen depending on what they thought was the right thing for the baby. So they actually pre-programmed the ventilators to give either the range of oxygen that was considered the usual range, that somewhere in there was the right number, was between, let's say, 85 to 95% oxygen inspired in the ventilator. So they programmed the ventilators to either give the lower end or the higher end, even though the clinicians and the nurses were thinking they were playing. I mean, they knew they were in a study, but they didn't have any control really about the oxygen saturation that the babies were getting. They, at the end of the study, I don't want to, like I said, this is a whole, talk in itself. It was again unclear results, and in the meta-analysis, something that something that thinks is garbage in, garbage out, but they kind of try to combine these. It's essentially like 12 studies, not just 3 studies, showed a lower rate of progression to blindness, to retinopathy of prematurity. This lowering, but it was at an increased cost of mortality again, but not as high as as was happening in the post-Kinsey period. And then the support study, especially, got embroiled in a big ethical controversy, condemnation, and then reversal by the NIH. And the main issues were the degree of informed consent, risks of experiment in studies that were varying usual care practices in an entangled care practice setting. And I really don't have time to fully explain this controversy, but let me just try to distill this to one point right now. The investigators felt they did not have to tell subjects or patients, whatever you think these parents or these kids were, that there were risks in participating in the study. They felt they were the same risks as practice. And there were risks to being a premature baby, and there were risks to all the things that were happening, but they didn't think per se the experiment itself presented any risks. And so they didn't go out of their way to say how much of an experiment it was. And there were other on-the-ground accommodations to the realities of practice that led to, that they hoped would streamline the paperwork. And overall, there was an attempt to make research as close to practice as possible, so to not jeopardize the generalizability of the study by scaring people away for no substantive reason. This was the defense or the logic behind what they did. But the general point I want to make here, and I guess I'm going to leave you hanging about my own views, is from this second episode, is that our ethics have not caught up with the high degree of entanglement of research and practice. This is a source of great controversy now in this particular study, but all over the place in medicine. Okay, so I'm going to now pivot to a few consequences of entangled bodies, just give you a little sense of what the project is about, beside translation challenges, which is really just one chapter of 5 challenges. And first, I want to consider how, let me just see if this works here, how the person experiencing the highly intervening body often feels very vulnerable because of the dependence on medical interventions. Among the many consequences that this vulnerability can lead to is increased demand for even more interventions, another cycle. Again, this is a self-reinforcing pattern, but I'm going to use another episode from the history of prostate cancer to illustrate. Okay. And this example comes from something, I have to say my method, my historical sources in a lot of this whole project is reading the medical literature against the grain, for things that aren't mentioned as results, but are just kind of like incidental findings. And this example is from something mentioned without any comment, really, almost as an aside, in the initial report of a large-scale study called the Prostate Cancer Prevention Trial. And what this was a trial of a medicine that began its life as a blood pressure medicine that has anti-androgenic, anti-male hormone qualities versus placebo. It's used to shrink the prostate gland for, very commonly used. But this is to see if it also can prevent prostate cancer as well. And forget about the results of that study, which are fascinating. But in the study, both the control arm and the group that got finasteride were given many, many blood tests. They were constantly poked to see if they had an elevated PSA test. And if some threshold was crossed, they then went on to biopsy. Now, at the end of the study, for reasons I'm not quite sure, I guess I do know because it clarifies a few questions. Everybody in the study, both in the control arm and the intervention arm, were offered, and I think that's the term that was used in the clinical reports, a biopsy if they hadn't received one in part of the study. And at the end of the day, 75% of the people who hadn't had a biopsy, over 8,000 men, agreed to say, volunteered, took up their offer, whatever you want to call it, to have a biopsy of the prostate gland, not a benign procedure. And I view this as evidence of a cycle of fear and vulnerability production and promise of control that drives lots of other practices, like the rising rates of contralateral prophylactic mastectomy. What I mean is to be in this study, which is in a sense like the real world in some ways, and to be constantly surveyed every 6 months to see if you have prostate cancer, leads to a kind of demand for, this is something that I explore a lot in risky medicine, leads to a demand to get some finality. And do I have cancer or do I not have cancer? Another consequence that I talk about in the book, not yet published, is that among people who have experienced many interventions, they and their clinicians are often challenged to distinguish the effects that arise from disease itself from the effects that come from interventions. And I want to elaborate on two consequences of this blurring, because it's contributed to the slow drift to measuring the efficacy and safety of interventions by their impact on other interventions and to more interventions. And let me explain and illustrate quickly. The first is the challenge is that this is not a new phenomenon. The first kind of historical point I want to make, and this is a the long-standing nature of this challenge of distinguishing intervention and disease is illustrated by this published reflection from a leading polio researcher about the interventions that were then current in the 1940s and 50s. The many prosthetic aids and devices like iron lungs that led to the situation that, in his words, many patients may not have had polio at the time of their admission, but by the time the interns got through with them, they certainly were surrounded by all the earmarks associated with the paralytic forms of that disease, along with a frightening thought that they might never be able to walk again. It's from John Paul, who has a very nice memoir of a very prominent virologist. The second aspect of this challenge is that many interventions transform bodies, and they produce changes that do not necessarily go away after the intervention, and which are often more profound and irreversible, I argue, than what's captured by the common sense medical terms like side effects or addiction or tolerance. And, I can only this is very anecdotal, I should say, my argument here. But let me illustrate with an anecdote from a New Yorker profile of the sleeping pill Ambien, which I happened to take last night. Here the author is citing the observations of a pharmaceutical researcher who told the writer, and Ambien, in common with many other drugs, can be tricky for some patients to give up. Those who stop abruptly may experience, quote unquote, rebound insomnia. That's worse than when they started. And they inaccurately assume, oh, my insomnia is really bad still. He laughed. It's actually a nice feature for a drug to have from the pharmaceutical perspective. And this transformation is true of so many interventions, perhaps most dramatically the impact of insulin on the life with diabetes, but also antidepressants and other interventions. And more than a side effect or tolerance, in some sense, and often a new disease intervention hybrid state, has emerged. Third aspect of this, distinguishing disease from intervention is that it leads to prescribing cascades, paradoxical reactions, and diagnostic cascades. And this is something I have gleaned from the medical literature. It's out there, and it's almost exclusively as a limited phenomenon, usually in the psychiatric literature. And here's the basic idea. This is a flow chart from one of these studies on prescribing cascades. And it's another one of these like relatively isolated things in the medical literature that may be just, from my perspective, a small part of a large phenomenon. And this is, an example of this is like, the way taking an antipsychotic or an antidepressant like the drug Abilify leads to tremor and masked faces, these classic signs of Parkinson's disease. And people make a new diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and then treat the Parkinson's. And the treatments of Parkinson's can also, as it happened to a friend of mine who had cogenital toxicity, itself lead to a medical problem. And as indicated in the flow chart, which I won't go into in any detail right now, I realize let's be talking slower than I usually talk. I feel like I'm talking very fast. As indicated in this flow chart, the cascade can include over-the-counter medications and devices. Sometimes in the medical literature, when devices and diagnostic tests are there, I think there's something broader happening, which you might think of as intervention cascades. And there's also some, a little bit of a literature out there of paradoxical reactions, where I think are a subset of this phenomena, where a drug appears to cause or exacerbate the targeted condition. The most well-known example of this is the paradoxical effect that antidepressants seem to have. Who knows what mechanism on adolescents taking antidepressants, leading to more suicides. And finally, just in more having to do with about medical knowledge, I'm shocked by the number of studies that I look at where efficacy is not defined as something we might think of as objective health outcome, but its impact on other interventions. And let me see if I have an example here. Yeah, so the drug Vioxx, which is now withdrawn from the market, was never claimed to be any better at relieving pain, or maybe some people claimed it was, than the existing drugs of the first class of COX inhibitors that it was competing against, but that it had lower side effects to it. Many drugs find their market niche this way increasingly. And Mikhail mentioned that I co-edited a volume and wrote some things about the history of the HPV vaccines. And when the initial studies were being done to approve and understand whether we needed an HPV vaccine at all, the real cost effectiveness, and of course the regulators are not allowed to use cost effectiveness in the US, which is a weird thing, but there were studies done on the putative cost effectiveness of the HPV vaccine, and it was unclear how much money would actually be saved per life in the number of people who were not going to die of cervical cancer or an HPV-related disease. But there was a huge amount of money, probably $3 billion a year, that could possibly be saved by reducing the number of false positive pap smears. So, that's another example of what I'm talking about here. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions, but I do want to answer the so what question, about this. Though I have to say, I'd love your feedback. I feel, even though I said I wasn't against medical interventions, and I'm not Luddite, at the end of the day, I draw some fairly subtle conclusions that, bother me in their subtlety, I would say, because I don't know in the end where I'm talking about complexity, and I don't know exactly how to reduce it. Anyway, but I should still give you some off the cuff things. I have time? Okay, all right. I see 6:21, and I thought I'd be out of here by 6:30. Okay, I'll slow down. Well, good segue to the first thing, slow medicine. And there's already many things out there to slow the evidence-challenged approval and diffusion of new interventions. And one not old, but like 1980s era clinical epi principle is randomize the first patient. That is, don't have things like PSA testing, just thrown into the world and do randomized trials years later around it. Very hard to do, by the way, for things you think are going to be life-threatening or preserving, like COVID vaccines, for example. Though there were randomized trials done, COVID vaccine. Less reliance on the promise of phase 4 surveillance. This cycle I talked about the way in which short endpoints and proxy endpoints are used with the promise of later phase 4 surveillance. Slow medicine. The story I'm telling does, provide support for a number of existing clinical initiatives that are motivated at the moment by waste and harm, but also we could add to them complexity in medical decision-making, which I think needs to be part of the health policy debate, and in particular, the Choose Wisely campaign of American Board of Internal Medicine and the many preventing overdiagnosis conferences and attempts to understand. So I think I'll give you a little aside here. I have a chapter on the history of the concept of overdiagnosis, and the punchline of that is it's just the tip of an iceberg. We basically have neglected prognosis, period. And the overdiagnosis, those of you know what I'm talking about, is just a very clear example of that. I think we need, recognizing the complexity of the intervened bodies is another argument for supporting social capacities for navigating and improvising, given the complexity and work of intervened in patienthood. I didn't really go into this, but many of our interventions circulate globally, but the infrastructure to safely and effectively use them don't. And this is another reason to maintain and invest in the infrastructure for safe and efficacious use of interventions. And I'm trying to resurrect. I'm not going to talk about ecological and evolutionary consequences. That's a new project that's kind of, you can ask me about it if you want. But I'm trying to resurrect, and I have a historical chapter in this draft book from past theorists of prognosis and clinical judgment, some insights to how we might make knowledge and teach skills relevant for the intervened in world. And these theorists, I'm going to go into a little bit, do I have a couple minutes? These theorists argued for using clinical rather than quote unquote objective variables in research, for a more expansive view and centrality for prognosis, for more detailed knowledge of how patients' behavior towards and within healthcare shapes medical outcomes, for creating and teaching clinical heuristics to deal with translation challenges. This is kind of a hodgepodge of things that I have found interesting in past clinical teachers, but also in their writings, some of them beginning in the early 20th century, before I ever appeared. Overall, I can lump these theorists, and I do in this chapter, as arguing for more investment in therapeutic rationalism or reasoning. And what do I mean by that? And what I mean here is, despite being an era of evidence-based medicine and promise of rule-based algorithmic practice, one implication of this project is that clinicians and consumers have more, not less, reliance on therapeutic rationalism and reasoning. I'm kind of against the grain here. And what do I mean by therapeutic rationalism and reasoning? Unlike rule or algorithm-based modes of action, directly following from empiric results of what works and what doesn't, we're expected to solve the individual problem, in scare quotes, with biological markers of individuality. I'm emphasizing the way clinicians and patient consumers need to apply to clinical translation knowledge about treatment mechanisms, disease mechanisms, the natural history of disease is gone, it's somehow dead. That's an earlier version of this project was, with highly intervened disease, you no longer have a disease. We no longer have knowledge of disease in the absence of treatment. Illness and healthcare behaviors and the forces shaping them and other elements of prognosis. And just by way of illustration, as recently as 1963, the then unrealized ideal of bedside clinical judgment involved elements that seem very, very foreign to us, just a few decades later, especially to the ideals of evidence-based medicine that have now become dominant. And let me just read this quote about the ideal physician doing clinical judgment from 1963. The rational physician decides to treat the patient on the basis of the disease the patient has, its pathophysiology, its natural history, and the drugs that will combat the disease and how they work. He learns all about the absorption, metabolism, excretion of the therapeutic agents he uses. In those cases in which he does not fully understand the mechanism of the drug's action, nor know how effective it has been when used in similar cases by others, the wise doctor seeks the advice of experts, either through consultation or by reading what they recommend. These procedures are elementary, but how often are they really followed? I'm not supporting this point of view, but it's just interesting to see how much has changed in what we think good decision making is about. Now, what do we need to recover from the past or create anew to aid therapeutic reasonings? I especially think we need a lot more research into prognosis. And the argument here is that we've reduced prognosis to sort of number of days left in a life or something, when it's a science of the individual, essentially. What's going to happen to that particular patient under these particular circumstances? For that, we need predictive knowledge of the intervened disease, which we've not developed. We still have a little bit of natural history of disease, but not so much, except from clinical trials, not so much about intervened disease. Comorbidity, its mechanisms and pathways. I mean, the COVID, everyone bands about how comorbidities lead to bad outcomes. We don't understand anything, I would say, about their mechanisms and pathways and what we mean. It's astounding historically to realize the term comorbidity was just invented in 1970 by a clinical teacher of mine, Alvin Feinstein. And Feinstein himself had another concept, which I find key to unlocking this puzzle, what he called iatrotropy. He always invented these neologisms that never caught on for good reason. This is like towards the medical system. And basically, he showed so much of our medical knowledge is confounded by the ways patients interact with healthcare. When in the course of illness, they seek care and how they complain or don't complain about it. Maybe I'll stop here. I don't know. I do think there's a lot of work to be done inculcating awareness of translation challenges and pitfalls and strategies for sidestepping the complexities I've talked about, rebalancing care to focus on symptoms and suffering more than objective abnormalities and diagnoses which litter the medical record, and to support healthcare navigation. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions. Thank you. Probably stay here in case there's anybody.
Yeah, and watch and chat right now.
I feel like I bombarded everybody with a whole sort of way of thinking about the body and its challenges. So forgive me if somebody's shell-shocked. Yeah.
There was a lot there that's very interesting and absorb it. But one of the things I thought was when you think of it in the space 4 world.
Yeah.
But when we talk about I hear people from pharmaceutical companies talk, they say, look, the problem is it's so expensive to do the research, to get a drug on the market. That's one of the reasons that there's all these drug costs and stuff. It's all this research costs, and it's the research cost of getting us through phase 3. And it seems like you want to say, well, we should be spending more time on that.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, the adaptive clinical trials that I talked about before are also attempts to reduce, it's a terrible problem for the drug manufacturers. Only 9% of oncology drugs, eventually, they can invest lots and lots of money and ever get to the end point there. I think, if I saw the world through the lens of the pharmaceutical company, I wouldn't like some of the solutions I'm proposing. There's a kind of assumption here that, a lot of that is wasteful. Me Too drugs, things motivated only by profit motive that aren't thought of, that aren't going to materially increase the health of people. But a lot of judgments, of course, have to be made. You're totally, right. This is, but I am, I'm not impressed. So many. I haven't done I'm relying on other health policy analysts and critics of the medical system who talk about how few of the promises made to do the phase 4 research ever actually get done. There's actually some legislation now pending its way through Congress to after the horse has left the barn, they're trying to shut it, to actually do something about this systemic problem in the way pharmaceuticals are. But anybody who's gone to a medical journal club and has looked at a clinical trial and then asked the question, how does this reflect on my practice? What should I do? Knows that even the most well-done clinical trials, short of the Women's Health Initiative, or a few classic examples of things we had a definite answer, it's very hard to apply these knowledge from really good experiments and think of the knowledge as definitive. So much of the stuff that's done in phase 4, especially the haphazard way we tend to collect data on side effects, and other things. So much of that data is useless too. It's not just not collected; it's also useless for asking the kind of fine-tuned questions. There's a movement within health policy and clinical epidemiology, what's sometimes called basic simple trials. They ask really broad, general questions with large numbers of people about things we still don't know. like, did antidepressants work? Not whether X drug versus Y drug is working or not. And I'm very sympathetic to that kind of pharmaceutical. And of course, students are sometimes shocked to learn that the fox is guarding the barn. Almost all clinical research is done by the makers of products, and given the number of things that are coming up, that's the only way it could be. But if we had some more centralized sort of a way of saying these are the important questions, we might be more willing to fund them. Christopher.
Thank you for the thought. So I think my question is really closely related to that because I teach with Steve Epstein's work on the AIDS crisis and needs. And the tone of that work is that, like, by responding to activists and working with activists, we sped things up and got more drugs available more quickly, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And the tone of your talk is let's go down. That's probably a bad thing. Have you worked that way to tease out when it seems like a good idea to speed things up? And
I have my own personal sense of it. In the middle of a pandemic, or a disease that's killing young, healthy people left and right. There's a role for stepping on the accelerator. Now, how much enduring, knowledge came out of, I was a young doctor in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and I, like, in my own mind, heroically was able to write drug manufacturers for independent drug approval for new drugs that, a patient of mine saw a Mike Douglas show, and thought might work and whatever. And, I was very caught up in that moment for those, for very good reasons that I don't regret looking back. On the other hand, I'm not sure how much enduring knowledge came out of a lot of those. In a way, it's a way of releasing medical power and giving people an outlet, but it's not the same thing as like finding robust knowledge of what works and what's safe. So there's a tension there that I'm never going to resolve at some level. And the answer, of course, is it depends on the situation. But I think if you look at the total volume of a lot of medical research and medical practice, some of my arguments make more sense.
There is a question from someone online right now, and she says, any advice on how better to communicate these systemic challenges and uncertainties to our patients in a way that helps guide the personal decisions? Oh boy.
I drove up here this morning, and I'll just say a family member called me about, her interactions with a doctor who had a small recurrence of breast cancer 20 years later. And when she tried to ask him, he wanted to treat her with a hormonal medication that actually made her quite sick. And she's 80 years old, at the moment. Like, what's the risk and benefit? He says, shut up and listen to me about it. And she said, you sent me for a bunch of tests. And like, what are the tests? You started reading to me. He's getting a PET scan, a scan of entire body and whatever. And the anecdote, I guess I hadn't thought about this before. I just listened to her and didn't feel I had the skills, because I had to deconstruct the whole worldview, frankly, to get this family member to understand the point I was making. And I thought I was just going to ruin her confidence in her physician, and it would not be worth it to venture there. I'm thinking about the sources of medical. I mean, this is an evasive answer, that it's very hard to digest this all. I mean, patients have experienced like a lot of iatrogenic harm, and they've experienced the complexity. They go to many doctors, they still don't know what to do. People will say, in my experience, this is what should be done. And they think, aren't we living in an evidence-based world? Like, why is people saying all these off-the-cuff things? There's a lot of like lived doubts and questions that you can reaffirm, I think, and begin with. And I'm not sure you can make any better decisions, but you can certainly have people understand kind of what's at stake and how we're in some sense experimenting when we do something. It doesn't have the full force of medical research. And that relates, this is not the answer to that person's good, very important question. I think, a lot of what I'm interested in is trust at some level. And, if nothing else in this COVID epidemic, I mean, there's a lot of different takes on this in some ways, but my take is somehow it's viewed as some like chink in the armor of medicine, and what trust it, that one day you say one thing and another day after some data you see another thing. In a way, it's a very like fickle, unrealistic view of like the state of our knowledge. I think what's actually more trust in the system if we're much more honest about what we don't know, how things are contingent, things can change on the basis of stuff, how we get the average patient to that point, or the doctor, to be honest, or anybody, to that point where you're not just frustrated and angry and you want this certainty, you're not getting it. I wouldn't say it's above my pay grade, but I more compose the question than answer it. I do think understanding how the sausage is made of medical knowledge and its impact on practice is, I guess, at least that's my hopefully a beginning contribution.
I wonder if you can say a little bit more about your views on prognosis. Like very quickly.
Yeah, part of it's my nervousness about it, because I love, this chapter on like the theorists of prognosis begins with I'm blocking on his name now. I've read every single thing he's written. A Scottish James Mackenzie, who had this like utopian idea of studying the entire population of St. Andrews, Scotland in the 1920s, and having a band of physicians go into people's homes and study sort of symptoms, not like they weren't going to make precise diagnoses, and correlate ways of life and individual variations. And it was thought to be like a precursor of Framingham, but it had a very different idea behind it, a kind of very radical epistemology of trying to understand in a comprehensive way the origins of disease and the individual variation that goes into disease. So it's kind of easy. It's a really good question because it's hard for me to be positive about it. I mean, today prognosis is like little scorecards that people have, usually on the most objective measures, that you can put into a little formula and predict, what's going to happen in a small way. I'd like to think that those kinds of quantitative measures can be incorporated with what I call diatropy, like things that clinicians know about who's likely to say what and what their threshold of seeking medical care is, and what, given this kind of disease, when they're likely to seek the medical establishment. It's going to be very narrative. In some ways, a combination of sort of the things that we can divine from predictive studies that follow people in longitudinal way through time, with clinical observations about these variations in individual behavior. But I don't think it can be, there's no science of the individual, in the end. It's kind of that's, my critique of a lot of the stuff that's unpersonalized precision medicine and other things like that, as if, there's, a single marker for a single problem that's going to solve things. So I think it's a lot of triangulation and also modeling of clinical reasoning of how you might incorporate what we know at an aggregate level to things that physicians have observed. But it's fuzzy, to be honest.
I'm also thinking about the questions that I just also finished my big lecture talking about AIM activism and rapid FDA approval, removing the placebo and trials, and really speeding things up. But it's not just a person who's kind of left with cancer trials.
The only thing that passed the Congress like 100-0 was the Cure Act, in like 2 years ago, that sort of shortcutted all kinds of bureaucracy to getting results, without anybody in that room understanding some of the dangers.
Right, and I think some of your colleagues are kind of saying, the opposite to this, right? To try that any medicine should be given up. But I mean, it's not just the activists. And I mean, people want more stuff. Yeah. And there's a market for this stuff. And the reason that we have people saying we don't need MRIs for back pain, which would be wisely, is because people are out there demanding MRIs for back pain. And then doctors are providing MRIs for back pain because they have all kinds of incentives to keep their patients happy. And to increase their satisfaction scores, because it's easier to order an MRI and spend 20 minutes describing why you don't need an MRI. So all the incentives skewed towards doing more. And you're saying, slow down, do less, but I mean, nobody wants to do less. Not the patients, they want more stuff done. And doctors are incentivizing more, and certainly the person who so what would be your allies to do less? Or would it just be kind of like a fiscal conservatism where they say, we can save money, parking up in the 70s and therapeutic nihilism, and why are we doing stuff? How can we do less?
I don't know, but when my head hits the pillow, I imagine the unmobilized army of perplexed patients who've been through the mill and not gotten better, who have been just overwhelmed by the complexity, they're iatrogenically harmed, there's no mobilization of that group at the moment. I've written 3 books, like you pointed out already, that kind of end on this note as well. So you might say not my credibility is low here, but it's something that the question, but also that kind of mobilization keeps me going.
Right, and also when you short on the books,
Yeah.
even people say, oh, this biopsy wasn't necessary, and they go through the, they still thank you for doing that biopsy that
Yeah.
shows that I don't have cancer. And your study about 75%, it's a transrectal biopsy.
Yeah. No, that's an amazing thing for me. Yeah. Anybody want to come up the stage and get one?
So it's something to do that, how can we stop all this doing? And this doing is completely lacking in evidence. And you say also it's divorced from clinical outcomes, but also divorced from biological realities, because the biological bodies we're studying are not the same as the biological bodies we're treating.
Yeah.
I think they're saying that.
Yeah, I am saying that.
Yes.
Well, we can talk about this, more, but I mean, I think it's hard, besides the things I said about mobilizing the harmed and the complex, the perplexed, you're right. There are so many incentives, not the least. I said I wasn't talking about capitalism and financial. It's a little bit of a sleight of hand to do that in some ways, because there's something behind, but I'm trying to focus on some mid-level. It may still be very utopian way of understanding, this last couple, I think I told you before, I spent like last week or two looking at some agents for this thing, trying to pitch the kind of applicability of this message to Joe Schmo, to the average reader, and they weren't buying it, I would say. My first 2 attempts at this, the kind of idea, the mobilization of history and multiple examples and a system that works, like that system you talked about, how fear is, that's what risky medicine is largely about, how risk is produced, and then we have a cure for risk, more intervention, and the vicious cycles that leads to, and things didn't change since 2015. I don't know. I mean, I'm still trying to articulate the problem, understand its deeper structural and historical roots, and hope that adds to the people who are concerned with waste and harm, make them our allies in a way, and go somewhere. But I don't claim to know, to be very optimistic. No. I'm just empathizing, with why I get up in the morning on this particular project. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
The unnecessary.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if you don't do stuff, they go on Twitter and say, we're not going to do anything, and then they charge you a copay, or I think about stuff, and they didn't do it, so now I'm going to go back and demand, and all the patient advocacy on it. Well, you should demand getting that test, and you're your own advocate, which is, and you can put it to in other settings, but I think there's a reason that. Right.
But I mean, there are there are counterexamples too. I mean, like I was talking to another friend of mine this morning who does have cancer, and is miraculously, alive now 11 or 12 years after his initial diagnosis, after 2 stem cell transplants and various things. And one of the things that could be done is to do a PET scan like this other relative is getting, to see whether things are brewing. And he asked his doctor, when's my next PET scan? And he said, sometime between now and never, around it. And then kind of try to explain how, he can hardly imagine how that knowledge the actionable aspects of what they would find would be any worse or better than if they found it later when some symptoms created, and all the harm and worry when they found a ditzel somewhere else in the body, and had that. And lots of clinicians have that common sense, and some patients, or maybe some for both of these things, some clinicians have that bit of common sense, and some patients are willing to hear it. Corinna, you had a. Yeah.
So I'm looking at this from the other.
Yes.
And navigating the medical system as the slow patient.
Say again?
Navigating the medical system as the slow patient.
Yes.
Also,
you need a lot of strength.
Yes, absolutely. And finding the right physicians who are actually willing to work with a slow patient who is maybe not willing to follow the quick advice, such as there is that advice. And so I wonder about 2 things.
Okay.
I wonder about
like whether you would be willing to elaborate what we said, trust between physician and patient, I guess you meant. And I wonder what would happen with your story and your work if you put the patient in there.
Yeah.
And that would be a very different work, obviously, very different sources. But
Yeah, I have, whatever, things I've observed and people I've talked to and clinical vignettes culled from the literature, but it is by no means a bottom-up story around it. But to get more substantive about it, you need a lot of medical experience, maybe books that you've read, I don't know, to be an effective slow patient about it. I mean, I can just deal with this anecdotally. It helps to have a medical degree. I would say I used to joke, but I think it may be true that when my son was born in 1992, that my wife and my son was born, the only child born to two physician parents who somehow had a pregnancy without an ultrasound. It took such active work for us to get to that point. Now, you might think it's a Luddite, ignorant position. The main reason this was being done at the time was to look for Down's abnormalities, and we had made a decision that we would live with the consequences around it. And it just, and it's just like it was so hard to do. But the fact that we had MDs attached to our name and whatever, I think, gave us the chutzpah, if nothing of the nerve, to make forceful arguments to make it happen. But good methodological point too, and maybe in revisions and stuff like that. I'm not going to reorient the whole book, but a very good point. Yeah, Christopher again. Do you have a question over there? Did someone? I'm just looking at bias to the right. Anybody over there have their hand up? Or okay, Christopher. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean,
No, it's fine.
This is going to be sort of an unfair question. She was sort of.
Can I just stop right now?
Sure. It's a really important talk. You're reading technical literature against the brain.
Yeah.
And your sort of internal analysis.
Right.
And sort of bounding exogenous factors.
Yes.
Corporate capitalism.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm going to ask you a question about cultural competence.
Yeah.
Because
it sneaks in there in a way, but since I do an inadequate job, I just kind of like gesture here and there. I don't want to claim that I'm doing,
Well, this is going to come out like this.
Yeah.
It's the result of someone who you just mentioned Birmingham.
Yeah.
And you mentioned polio in your talk, and you mentioned the case study of blindness.
Yes.
I'm wondering how much is fear of disability a factor in these interventions?
Yeah.
This idea that like the worst possible thing that could happen is to have a disabled child or to live a disabled child.
It's an amazing. Okay, so for people who couldn't hear it, Christopher asked a brilliant question, one that I'm wrestling with, which is how much in the examples I gave of polio, of I forgot the first thing you mentioned, Down syndrome, and of retinopathy of prematurity, does fear of disability, huge amount. And what's really fascinating is how unarticulated the assumptions were, almost till like the 2010s, about it's like a dirty, rotten secret that it was going to, and the patronizing physicians thought they were in concert with the families while doing this to save them this horrible outcome of blunt. They can always have another baby or something, around it, at the cost of death of premature infants, So, and then Down syndrome, I don't know if this is a new era, the way Down screening happens, but, it used to be that, we were taught, the amniocentesis was the way to actually see whether you had Down's trial. And this was done at 3 months, and it was done for women 35 and older. And if you asked, like your clinician, usually why not do it? Most Down's children are born to younger women, actually, why are you doing it at age 35 from a population perspective? And in as much as there was an answer, there was some equation that the rate of amniocentesis induced fetal death equaled the rate of Down's outcomes at age 35. The curves crossed. And where the assumption came from, besides some kind of like simplicity or something, that this disability outcome was equal in some sense to the risk of a loss of life. Again, unarticulated, but just kind of thrown out there. So disentangling the fear of, and I have to say, like, I had one of our graduates, these are two graduates from the Penn History and Sociology Science Department. I had another graduate do some research for me for this project. And I shared with her some of my notes on the retinopathy of prematurity thing, whatever. And, you know, this is another issue entirely. She wondered about my kind of casual use of blindness as a category through this thing. And at first I was just sort of like almost laughed at her, saying that was historic, that was the actor's category. You know, that's what people talk about this in the story. And then I realized the assumptions I was carrying with me, and unintentionally, I would say, not that I still know the answer to how to talk about it at some level, but I'm just, it's like an onion. I keep on uncovering more and more things that are just in those three examples and many others that are incredibly powerful. And some people have speculated that physicians have just many times projected their own values onto the patients too, that families, you know, didn't fear blindness in this kind of way, you know, at some level. It's like there's a sort of, there is some voices saying that earlier around it, usually by physicians who are more enlightened than other physicians, not the voices of patients and families so much, but really provocative question around it. And really, I think analytically, like that's really key to those examples. Sure. Yeah. How's your handwriting? I wonder if you thought much about, you know, how the consolidation of medical practice into large institutions in the US reinforces the financial incentives toward over-testing. Does University of Rochester do advertising? The health system, does it advertise? I mean, Penn just continuously advertises proton beam therapy, you know, like this is part of the answer. Yes, the answer is yes. How much? Yes, a lot at some level. I would say, generally speaking, the economic organization of medical practice, which includes consolidation, but lots of other factors, lies behind, you know, incentives toward overtesting because they're, you know, it sells. You know, it's what, you know. I mean, the other thing that's sold at Penn is the CAR T therapy. I don't want to go into it, you know, it's really quite exciting and interesting, but it doesn't fit this category. So, yeah.
All right, well, we have a little bit of a wine and cheese reception.
All right.
Ask more questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman.
Yeah.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Thank you guys for coming. And I am going to remind everybody that we're meeting here next month for Professor Christopher Whitney, who's in the audience. From the RIT, we'll be talking about his new project, Blood Money, about crafts. And I don't have the whole title. But I think you should get that name. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. This is very, like, I would like to get some reality. I wouldn't talk about this one, of course, so this is very, like, good to see these levels of questions and interest, and even if I don't have words. Yeah. Maybe time, chloride, it's just check out a multiple.
Yeah, no,
So that doctor's a little ahead of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not pretty sure.
Weird. Something like this.
Yes, okay, I can do that right now. Yeah.
Not that I'm like.
No, but yeah.
I don't think anybody can